It's not the things we have to do, it's the things we choose to do that are the measure of us. It's not what we do for money, it's what we do for love, which is really the sign of our quality as human beings.
Hello and welcome to Australia's Heartland with Tony Abbott. I'm Daniel Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs. Australia's Heartland with Tony Abbott is your voice. Each week, Tony and I discuss mainstream Australian values, the future of the Australian way of life, family, community and Australian culture. More importantly, we want to hear from you. That is why we have the Tell Tony Abbott segment at the end of each show where you can ask Tony your questions on whatever topic you want. Phone in to the Australian Heartland hotline on 03 9946 4307 to leave your question. You can also go to the website australia.ipa.org.au where you can join the Australian Heartland community and sign up to receive this podcast sent to you each week along with special analysis from the Institute of Public Affairs. Thank you for supporting the Australian way of life, and now to this week's episode. Hello Tony and g'day to all of our listeners. It's wonderful to be with you for another episode of Australia's Heartland with Tony Abbott. Before we get into it, I just want to remind everyone to hit subscribe or like wherever you're listening to this podcast so that you don't miss an episode. Tony, I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today. There's a lot to talk about. We're going to discuss the important role that volunteering plays in Australian society. We're going to talk about Australia's post-COVID future and why we have so much to look forward to, even though so many of us are doing it tough at the moment. To begin with, though, Tony, I'd like to get your assessment and analysis of an important new security pact signed about a week ago between Australia, the UK and the US, which, amongst other things, will give Australia access to nuclear submarines rather than the more antiquated diesel submarines. Tony, you've got a lot of experience in the area of defence and foreign policy. Can you help us understand what this deal means for the future of Australia?
Thanks, Daniel. Look, this is one of the most important decisions an Australian government has made in decades. It ends generations of strategic caution, and it indicates a willingness by Australia to play our part in the great strategic struggles of our time. It means that we will have much more effective submarines, and submarines are the best strategic deterrent that a country can have. It means that Britain is once more engaging east of Suez, which is going to be very important in terms of countering a very belligerent and assertive China. And it means that Australia will play a much more significant part in the overall Western Alliance in the future than we have in the past. So this is a very, very big shift. That said, the important thing is to get a nuclear submarine capability as quickly as possible. And my anxiety is that, as announced last week, a nuclear submarine for Australia could still be at least a decade away, even more. My very strong view is that if the mid-2030s was too late to get the French conventional submarines, the late 2030s is too late to get the Anglo-American nuclear submarines.
Tony, why does it take so long to get these kind of operations up and running? I think to a lot of Australians, we've been dismayed about, firstly, the cost, but secondly, just how long it takes. Given your experience in Parliament and Prime Minister, can you help us understand what factors are contributing to that? Is it just the example of just the bureaucracy taking forever to get moving, or is there something else happening?
Look, that's a very, very good question, Daniel. And I think there are a host of reasons why things take so long. The first is everything is much more bureaucratic than it ever was before. The second is everyone is much more safety conscious than ever before. And look, within reason, that's fair enough. And the third is that we always seem now to want something which is not only best in class, but specifically designed and modified for Australian conditions. So instead of just taking a ship that's in service with the Royal Navy or a ship that's in service with the US Navy, we'll say, well, we'll take that particular design, but actually we want to add this, we want to change that. And every time you add something or change something, you delay.
Yeah, absolutely, Tony. Well said. And what I want to reflect on here is, so we talk about our defence capabilities, but I also want to discuss and get your insights into our national self-confidence, because I think that that's as important as having the capabilities themselves. And I want to put to you a quote by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was one of the most famous dissidents of the Soviet Union, wrote the Gulag Archipelago, gave a famous address, commencement address at Harvard University. This was back in 1978, but I think what he said then is more relevant today than perhaps what it was then. So I'm going to quote to you what he said and then get your thoughts and assessment of that. And I quote him, "No weapons, no matter how powerful, can help the West until it overcomes its loss of willpower," end quote. Tony, our values and our belief in our values and our belief in what we're defending is surely just as important, if not more important, than the technical capabilities that we have to defend ourselves. Do you agree?
Yes, I do, Daniel, but I do want to, I suppose, take issue a little with what you're putting to me. Solzhenitsyn made that observation back in 1978, 40-odd years back, and notwithstanding the weakness of will and the ambivalence and the confusion that Solzhenitsyn detected back in the late 70s, the West did go on to win the Cold War, and the old Soviet Union is now at one with Nineveh and Tyre. It is almost inherent in a democracy where 1,000 flowers bloom and where 1,000 discordant voices can be raised, that we will look more divided and confused than we often are. And the fact that there are dissident voices in our society, up to a point at least, is a strength, not a weakness. So while I completely agree that in the end we have to have sufficient self-belief to be prepared to stand up for ourselves, the mere fact that we often have a pretty vigorous debate about our own faults and failings is not of itself fatal to our survival. Now, the 1970s were a dispiriting time. I think the current times are at least equally dispiriting, but the fact that we are focused on ourselves, introspective, anxious, lacking in self-confidence, apparently in retreat today, doesn't mean that we can't recover just as swiftly as the West recovered in the early 80s under people like Thatcher and Reagan and the influence of people like Pope John Paul II. Just because things don't look great today doesn't mean that we are in a process of terminal decline.
Well, let's talk about recovery. I was going to turn to this at the end, but you bring it up now, and I think it's an important point that a lot of people have on their minds is, yes, we're in a very difficult period of time, and I think we're going to be in for at least a couple of more years of challenges related to COVID. I think that there's a lot of fairly deep structural changes that the COVID lockdowns are causing to freedom of speech, to the loss of small businesses, to the decline of a lot of civic institutions. But I know you've got a pretty optimistic take on Australia's future. Can you help us understand, use the word recovery, what will be the mechanisms that you think will allow us to recover, either in specific terms or in general principles?
I think we've just been through 2 lost years. And okay, we haven't had the number of COVID deaths that countries like the United States and the United Kingdom have had. But we've certainly suffered 2 years when normal life has essentially been either in suspension or under threat of suspension. For 2 years almost, no one has been able to make any plans in this country because at the first sign of an infection, everything, whether it's a wedding, a holiday, a business, has been liable to closure, to being overruled by government. So I think it's been a very dispiriting time. Over the last 18 months or so, safety has been everything, freedom has been nothing. We've put a value on life itself, almost priceless, and effectively we've put a value on living, almost worthless. And I think this has been a serious derangement of our normal priorities and our normal approach to things. Now, my hope is that having lived through this absolutely dispiriting time, this incredibly vexing to the spirit time, when we do come out on the other side, and in New South Wales that should start in about a month. In Victoria, hopefully it will start within a couple of months. Having been effectively deprived of our normal freedom, having been effectively deprived of our normal ability to control our lives, we will cherish that freedom. We will savour that autonomy more than ever before, and we will make more of it in the future than we've made of it in the past, because we've gone through this dreadful experience of being infantilised by government.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tony. I think there's a lot to that. I caught up with a couple of our neighbours the other day for a barbecue, which is something we haven't been able to do for a while, and we've all got kids and they're all running
was outside
around.
And you were fully masked at all times when you weren't actually consuming food and drink, and I hope there was no alcohol involved.
We were following the law, but it was just a reminder of how important those, what you would have thought of as somewhat, trivial everyday interactions are. And I think you're right that we will appreciate our freedoms and our local communities and small businesses and the things that have really suffered over the last couple of years. I reckon that there will be a renewed sort of enthusiasm.
Well, I so hope you're right, Daniel. I want to believe that's the case. There would have to be quite a lot of small business people, though, that have given up after having been closed down in Victoria for the 6th time, after having been closed down here in New South Wales so far, I think about 11 weeks and counting. All those youngsters that have had 2 years of their school and university stolen from them, all those people who would like to be getting out and about and meeting perhaps a life partner who haven't been able to do so for the best part of 2 years. That will leave, I think, a lasting scar. But the post-war period was a period of great vitality and vigour in this country, even after the Great War, despite the pall of death and the funereal sense which haunted so many societies. They did manage the Roaring Twenties as well. So let's hope we have another version of the Roaring Twenties coming up.
Well, I certainly hope so. One thing that has, I think, united Australians and brought the best out of Australians is our sense of volunteering and our sense of community spirit. And I did want to discuss with you volunteering and the broader, I guess, institutions of civic society and how that binds us together. And you're somebody who has a lot of experience and demonstrated a lot of leadership in your local community, whether it's with firefighting, whether it's with your work in Indigenous communities, whether it's with your experience in surf lifesaving. So I want to explore all of that. What I wanted to start with was to get your assessment and insights into why volunteering is so essential to the Australian way of life and the Australian character as we know it today.
Well, Daniel, it's not the things we have to do, it's the things we choose to do that are the measure of us. It's it's not what we do for money, it's what we do for love, which is really the sign of our quality as human beings. And I think it has long been a characteristic of Australian society, probably of English-speaking societies generally, but particularly of Australian society, where if we see a problem, we don't sit around and complain that the government hasn't done enough. We roll up our sleeves and we do what we can, whether it be Neighbourhood Watch, whether it be Clean Up Australia Day, or whether it be in a more enduring and arguably more important sense, things like the volunteer bushfire brigades, the volunteer surf clubs, all the volunteer sports associations, the volunteer groups that spring up around hospitals and churches, the volunteer social welfare groups like St Vincent de Paul, the Smith family, etc. These are all signs that when Australians see a problem, instead of shrugging their shoulders and walking by, instead of demanding that someone else do something about it, their natural instinct is to say, well, if not me, who? And in company, normally with others, doing what they can to help. Now, I can remember quite a few years ago, back in 1994 it was, Margie and I were living in Fox Valley Road, Wahroonga, just on the edge of Lane Cove National Park. I was coming home from work one stinking hot day in December, and I could see the flames leaping up near Ryde Bridge, and I thought to myself, my God, this is not great. I did manage finally to get home around the traffic diversions, and all was well, but I made a resolution then and there that I was going to join the local bushfire brigade. And as it happened, not long after I became a Member of Parliament, so nothing came of that resolution then. But the week after the Olympics in Sydney in 2000, we had a very bad bushfire in Bantry Bay in my electorate. And I remember on the Friday I was out door knocking in Killarney Heights, and there were fireballs rolling up the hill on the other side of the bay towards Manly Dam. And I thought, this is pretty damn serious. And on the Sunday, I was down at Nippers talking to one of the other Nippers parents whose kids were at school with mine and were both in the Nippers. And I said to my friend Ray, I said, that fire must have come pretty close to you on Friday. And he said, well, as a matter of fact, on Friday night, I was on my veranda having a few drinks, and the poor buggers down the end of the street in their uniforms with their truck were trying to put out the fire. He said, I feel so guilty. I want to join the fire brigade. And I said, well, mate, I will come with you. So the two of us went up later that day, signed up, and 20 odd years later, I'm still there. Ray did 10 years of service before a couple of health issues meant that he couldn't really continue. But this is how it happens. You see a problem, you think, if I'm not prepared to do anything about it, who is? And away you go.
Do you think that spirit is still with us? We know that government has got a lot bigger, a lot more intrusive. Is there still something, fairly fundamental to the Australian character that means that people are still going to roll up their sleeves and fix things, or have we become a little bit more passive, a little bit more apathetic? What do you think?
Again, it's a very good question. I think it's not so much that we've become passive. I suspect it might be more that we have become more fastidious in terms of qualifications, in terms of specifications, safetyism, if you like. I can remember back in 2000 when that Bantry Bay fire was first happened. Before the Sunday, when I was chatting to my mate Ray, I'd rung up fire control, the local fire control, and I said, look, I'm Tony Abbott, I'm the local member, how can I be helpful? And they said to me, well, if you're not trained, you can't be helpful. So they put me back in my box, so to speak. And Ray and I did go through the training. And in those days, the training was basically a couple of weekends to get your basic competency. Now, my fear is that the obstacle to volunteerism is less a decline in our civic mindedness, but more a rise in the requirements for people doing anything with others. And this is where I think we have to draw a reasonable balance between expecting, if you like, uber professionalism and being prepared to accept that people come to these things with certain basic abilities and putting them to good use.
Tony, I just want to ask you something about how being a volunteer and a volunteer firefighter in particular has influenced your outlook on life. I can imagine that facing massive walls of fire, putting your life on the line, really would help put politics and public life into perspective. Do you find that helped you get a better perspective of things in life and made you a better, more rounded person as a result?
There's no doubt that you can easily get caught up in this political bubble, particularly when you're a minister in a government. You're very busy. You've got a large staff. You're always in meetings. You're always doing important, in inverted commas, things. And it is possible to get, I think, quite detached from the real world. I used to find going down to do a surf patrol on a Sunday with people who paid very little attention to politics on a day-to-day basis, going off to do a duty crew on a Sunday with people who didn't regard you as anything special just because you were a cabinet minister. It was therapeutic in the best sense of the word. It kept you grounded. It stopped you from being too big for your boots, and really, really important. I can remember the first time I put my hand up to be a deputy captain in the brigade back in 2007. I was the leader of the House of Representatives. At the time, I'd been a cabinet minister for something like 7 or 8 years. And I was beaten for the last deputy captain's position by a guy who at that stage was a mechanic between jobs. Now, the brigade made the right decision because the guy in question, who's a friend of mine and now works full-time for the RFS, was a better firefighter. But it was probably good for me, good for my soul, and an interesting illustration of Australian egalitarianism that the cabinet minister was beaten by the motor mechanic for that particular position.
Yeah, it's a great story, and of course you are still a deputy captain now, aren't you? You did later become a deputy captain.
Look, I did become a deputy captain in 2008. I had to quit when I became opposition leader in 2009. And the brigade was good enough to have me back as a deputy captain when I left Parliament. I can remember my first operational deployment, Daniel. It was a Sunday at the beginning of 2001. I think it was the first Sunday in 2001. And we were on a duty crew, and at about 3:00 the radio crackled into life, asking for crews to deploy overnight to Wyong because there was a fire that they were worried about up there. And the skipper turned around and said to us in the back seat, "Are you guys available for a overnight deployment?" Now, I'd just been promoted to cabinet at the time, and I was supposed to be in Canberra the following morning for a cabinet subcommittee meeting. And I thought to myself, if I tell these guys that I'm not available because I've got to go to Canberra for cabinet, they will never take me seriously again. So I took a deep breath and I said, I'm available. And as the truck was screaming up the expressway to Wyong, I rang my office and said, you're going to have to tell them that I'm going to be late to this meeting in Canberra tomorrow. Don't explain why, but just say something's come up. Anyway, we did our bit and we saved the outskirts of Wyong from this fire. And I finally got down to Canberra about midday that morning, a couple of hours late for the meeting, smelling like a barbecue. And as I walked into the meeting, someone said to me, oh, where were you, Tony? And I said, I got called out with the local fire brigade last night. And my cabinet colleague said, oh, Tony, you're a cabinet minister now. And I said to her, I said, you've got to be a human being before you can be a cabinet minister. Now, it was a spontaneous remark, one of the few spontaneous remarks that actually hits the spot. And I think that's absolutely right. You do have to be a human being before you can be a cabinet minister. And things like this definitely do help to keep people grounded.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. Thanks for sharing it, Tony. And I think that's a great spot for us to move to our Tell Tony Abbott segment, which is our favourite part of the podcast, where our listeners get the opportunity to have a chat with us and to ask Tony their questions of the day. And just before we get to those questions, I'd just like to remind everybody, wherever you're listening to this podcast, on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, to subscribe or like to make sure that you don't miss an episode. Tony, a couple of questions that I want to get to. The first is from Paul, and Paul has a question about getting our freedoms back and what do we have to do. And this is Paul's question. What can we do to get our freedoms back from these state premiers who don't want to give up their power?
Well, we've just got to keep making our voices heard, and whether it's sending an email to your local member, ringing up Talkback Radio, if you're on social media, saying your two bobs worth on social media, talking to your family, to your friends, to your neighbours, etc. We've just got to say, look, we cannot let fear of dying stop us from living. We cannot be so obsessed with one particular virus that all the other concerns of life are allowed to go by the board.
Yeah, absolutely, Tony. I want to go to our next question, which is from Clarissa. And Clarissa's question is about the mayhem that we saw in Melbourne yesterday at the CFMMEU headquarters. And Clarissa's question is this. It's more of a statement, actually. The protest of construction workers against their union, the CFMMEU, about mandatory vaccination shows leaders of unions don't care about workers anymore. Tony, how would you respond to Clarissa's observation?
I don't think anyone should break the law, but I can certainly understand people resenting what they see as bad laws and wanting to protest against them. I don't think the problem of out-of-touch leadership is confined to the CFMEU. I think this is a problem across the board today. The difference between the elites and the mainstream, the difference between the leaders and the led. I think this is a widening gulf across the board. Now, I encourage people to get vaccinated. I'm certainly vaccinated myself, and I got vaccinated as quickly as I could because I didn't want government to have any excuse not to give us back our freedoms as quickly as possible. But if for whatever reason people don't want to get vaccinated, unless they're in very specific occupations like working in nursing homes or working with the very vulnerable, you've just got to allow people to make their own choices.
Absolutely. Well said. Thank you, Tony, and thank you to all of our listeners. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I'll talk to you next week.
Good on you, Daniel.
Thank you for listening to Australia's Heartland with Tony Abbott, and thank you for your support of the Australian way of life. This has been a production of the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more or to become a member, head to ipa.org.au.